Every so often, a case comes along that does not just shock a city, but shakes an entire nation to its core. The story of Elisa Izquierdo is one of those cases. It is not simply a story about violence, but about a child whose life was filled with innocence, hope, and dreams, only to be taken away in the most brutal manner imaginable. To understand why police officers described this as the most violent case they had ever seen, we must begin at the start of Elisa's life, because tragedy was written into her world long before her final day. Elisa was born in April of 1989 in New York City. Her father, Gustavo Izquierdo, was a Cuban immigrant who adored his daughter from the moment she came into the world. Friends and relatives often described him as a devoted man who wanted nothing more than to give his child a safe and nurturing life. Elisa's mother, Awilda Lopez, had a troubled past, one that would later define the nightmare Elisa was forced to endure. Awilda struggled with drug addiction and a chaotic lifestyle, and even from the beginning, the courts had to decide whether Elisa should be raised by her father or her mother. At first, Elisa's early years were bright because her father took custody. Gustavo poured his heart into raising her. Neighbors would recall how Elisa was always dressed neatly, how her father would walk her to school, and how her face lit up with joy whenever she played with friends. There was a gentleness about Elisa that made people notice her. She loved to draw, loved fairy tales, and had an innocence that stood out even in a city that often felt cold and rushed. But Gustavo faced his own struggles. He was undocumented, and because of that, he constantly worried about his ability to provide for Elisa. Still, he did everything within his power to keep her safe. What he feared most was losing custody, because he knew the dangers of the environment Elisa's mother lived in. That fear would later become a devastating reality. Tragedy struck in 1990 when Gustavo fell ill. He battled cancer, and as his health declined, the question of Elisa's custody returned to the courts. Before his death, he pleaded with the system to ensure Elisa would remain in a safe home, away from her mother's influence. Teachers, neighbors, and even relatives warned that Awilda was not capable of raising a child. They spoke about her drug use, her unstable relationships, and her history of neglect. Yet, despite all these warnings, the court eventually granted Awilda custody of Elisa. This decision would prove fatal. When Elisa went to live with her mother, her once bright world began to darken. The loving care her father had given her was replaced with cruelty, neglect, and abuse. But at this early stage, people who knew Elisa still believed that perhaps the worst could be avoided. She still attended school, she still had moments of laughter, and she still showed resilience in the face of difficulty. Yet behind closed doors, the seeds of tragedy were already being sown. It is important to understand the environment Elisa was placed in. The New York of the early 1990s was a city struggling with crime, poverty, and drugs. Entire communities were caught in cycles of violence and addiction. In that atmosphere, children like Elisa were especially vulnerable. Social services were overwhelmed, courts were stretched thin, and mistakes were made, mistakes that would cost lives. One of the haunting aspects of Elisa's story is how many opportunities there were to protect her. Teachers noticed bruises. Relatives tried to intervene. Even neighbors made reports. But time after time, the system that was supposed to protect children failed to act quickly enough or strongly enough. Elisa's case became a chilling symbol of systemic failure, where bureaucracy and indifference allowed an innocent girl to fall through the cracks. And yet, even in those early days of hardship, Elisa's spirit shone. Her teachers described her as kind, polite, and eager to learn. She loved to read and often dreamed of becoming a teacher herself one day. In class, she was the type of child who wanted to help others, who would share crayons, or comfort another child who was sad. That purity of heart makes her story even more devastating, because the world she imagined for herself was so different from the one she was trapped in. As Elisa's life shifted from safety to danger, one thing became clear. Her story was not just about one violent act at the end, but about years of warning signs ignored. Her father's dying wish had been to protect her. He saw what others did not want to see, and his greatest fear came true. Elisa had been taken from a home of love and placed into a home of terror. What police officers would later discover on the night of her death was not just the result of one bad evening. It was the result of a cycle of neglect, cruelty, and indifference that had been building for years. The tragedy of Elisa Izquierdo is that she was failed by nearly every adult who should have protected her. Her mother, the courts, and the very system meant to shield children from harm. But before we reach that heartbreaking night, we must look deeper into the years Elisa lived with her mother. It is within those years that the truth of her suffering is revealed, and the silence of those who could have helped becomes impossible to ignore. The abuse, system failures, and Elisa's cry for help. When Elisa Izquierdo moved into her mother's care, the change was not just a shift of households. It was a complete reversal of her world. The warmth, safety, and consistency that her father had provided vanished overnight. What took its place was fear, violence, and a relentless cycle of abuse that shocked even hardened investigators when the full truth was finally revealed. Awelda Lopez, Elisa's mother, was not a woman prepared to nurture a child. She was consumed by her drug addiction, trapped in toxic relationships, and often more interested in her next high than in her daughter's well-being. From the moment Elisa entered that apartment in Brooklyn, she entered a nightmare that would grow darker with each passing year. At first, the signs were subtle to outsiders. Elisa began showing up to school with small bruises, the kind a child might get from rough play. But teachers noticed something deeper. She had begun to lose her smile. The little girl who once ran eagerly into the classroom was quieter and more withdrawn. She flinched when adults raised their voices, and she avoided eye contact whenever questions about home were asked. Teachers grew concerned, but in the world of the 1990s, suspicion alone was often not enough to trigger swift intervention. Then, the bruises became harder to ignore. Reports were filed with Child Protective Services. Elisa's relatives raised alarm after alarm. One relative even begged the courts to reconsider custody, warning that Elisa was in grave danger. Still, the wheels of the system turned slowly, almost deliberately, and Elisa was left in harm's way. The abuse Elisa suffered was not only physical but also psychological. Awelda told Elisa that she was unwanted, that she was a burden, and that she would never be loved. Imagine being a small child and hearing those words from the very person who is supposed to protect you. Elisa was mocked, belittled, and punished for the smallest mistakes. Her hair was pulled, her face was slapped, and she was often locked away when Awelda did not want to deal with her. Yet in school, Elisa tried to hold on to the last pieces of her innocence. Her teachers noticed how she still clung to fairy tales, stories about princesses who were saved from cruel stepmothers or dangerous villains. Elisa, in her own way, believed that someone would come to rescue her. Perhaps it would be a teacher. Perhaps it would be the system her father had trusted, or perhaps she hoped for some miracle that never came. What makes Elisa's case so haunting is the number of missed opportunities to save her. Social workers visited her home, but reports were closed. Relatives filed complaints, but courts dismissed them. At one point, a school administrator directly pleaded with child services, stating that Elisa was living in fear and needed immediate protection. But in a tragic display of bureaucracy, Elisa was sent back to her abuser time and time again. The abuse escalated over the years. Elisa's once neat appearance turned to signs of neglect. She often came to school hungry, her clothes unwashed, her hair matted. Teachers did what they could, feeding her and offering her kindness. But kindness could only go so far when Elisa had to return to the same dangerous home every night. By the mid-1990s, Elisa was living in what can only be described as a torture chamber disguised as an apartment. Awelda's drug use had spiraled further, and her rage became uncontrollable. Elisa became the target of that rage. Neighbors later testified that they heard screaming from the apartment, and the sounds of slaps and cries that went unanswered. Some neighbors tried to intervene, but in communities where police presence often meant more trouble than help, people were afraid to push too hard. One of the most heartbreaking details from Elisa's story comes from her schoolwork. In one assignment, she wrote that she wished for a home full of love. Simple words from a little girl, but they reveal a desperate cry for safety. Elisa knew what she was missing, and she longed for it in the only way she could express, through her writing. Her teachers held on to these assignments after her death, proof of how she had tried to speak even when her voice was silenced at home. The cruelty Elisa endured was shocking even to seasoned investigators. She was forced to eat her own feces at times, locked in rooms for hours, and beaten with objects. This was not discipline, it was sadistic abuse. Awelda treated Elisa not as her daughter, but as an outlet for her anger, resentment, and self-destruction. And each time Elisa returned to school with new bruises or new fears, the question grew louder: why was no one stopping this? The truth is that Elisa's death was not only the result of one violent parent, but also the result of a broken system. Child Protective Services failed her. The courts failed her. Society failed her. Even when Elisa's own relatives fought for her, they were told that the law had spoken and that custody belonged to a wielder. In one of the most bitter ironies of the case, Elisa's father had predicted this very outcome before his death. He had warned the system that a wielder was unfit, and his warning was ignored. What makes the case even more painful is that Elisa herself seemed to know that her time was running out. Children are often more perceptive than adults give them credit for. Elisa's withdrawn behavior, her written assignments, and her soft-spoken nature all painted the portrait of a child who understood that she was in danger but had no power to escape it. She trusted that adults would save her, and those adults failed again and again. The horror of Elisa's abuse is difficult to even speak about, and for many, it is easier to turn away than to face the reality. But her story matters because it is not just about Elisa. It is about every child who has been left in harm's way, every cry for help that has gone unheard, and every failure of the systems that are supposed to protect the innocent. By 1995, Elisa was only 6 years old, yet she had endured more suffering than most people will in a lifetime, and the most violent chapter of her life had not yet been written. Police would soon be called to a scene so brutal, so devastating, that even the most experienced officers described it as the worst they had ever witnessed. Before that tragic night, Elisa endured years of pain that should have been stopped, and when the end came, it was not sudden. It was the final act of cruelty in a pattern that had been building since the day she was taken from her father's arms. As we move into the final days of Elisa's life, prepare yourself, because the events that unfolded would scar New York City forever. The death of Elisa Izquierdo was not just another crime. It became a symbol of everything broken within a society that promised to protect its children. The murder of Elisa Izquierdo. The night police could never forget. By the time Elisa Izquierdo reached 6 years old, her life had already been marked by years of abuse, neglect, and betrayal from the very systems meant to protect her. But nothing could prepare New York City, or the police officers who responded that night, for what they would find in November 1995. The brutality Elisa suffered in her final hours would forever be remembered as one of the most violent cases investigators had ever seen. It was the day after Thanksgiving, November 26, 1995, when the call came in. Neighbors had reported chaos in the apartment, sounds of violence, and then silence. When police arrived at the Brooklyn residence where Elisa lived with her mother, they stepped into a nightmare. What they found inside was not just a crime scene, but a portrait of cruelty so severe that hardened detectives would later admit they could not sleep for weeks. Elisa's small body was discovered inside the apartment. She was lifeless, battered, and broken. The details, even for professionals used to violent crime, were beyond comprehension. She had been beaten repeatedly, her tiny frame covered in bruises. Investigators determined that she had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, with the blows so severe that her skull was fractured. Elisa had also endured internal injuries from the repeated assaults, leaving her body in a state of unimaginable suffering before her death. Police officers who first saw the scene later described it as the most violent and disturbing case involving a child that they had ever encountered. One detective admitted that the memory never left him, that the image of Elisa's broken body haunted him long after he left the force. Another officer said that it was the kind of case that makes you question humanity itself, because no one could understand how a mother could unleash such horror on her own child. The investigation quickly revealed the truth. Elisa had been beaten to death by her mother, Awilda Lopez, during a fit of rage. Neighbors reported hearing screaming and banging from inside the apartment earlier that evening. Some recalled Elisa's terrified cries echoing through the walls. But by the time police forced their way in, it was too late. Elisa was gone. The brutality of the attack was staggering. Medical examiners documented the injuries with horror. Elisa had endured repeated blows not just in the moments before her death, but throughout her short life. Her body showed signs of chronic abuse, old fractures, healed bruises, and scars that told a story of prolonged suffering. The final beating was simply the last chapter of a long cycle of violence. News of Elisa's death spread quickly, and the city of New York erupted in grief and outrage. Even in a city that had grown almost numb to crime during the turbulent 1990s, this case was different. This was not gang violence, not a random attack on the streets. It was the slow, torturous destruction of a child within her own home, a home that the courts and child services had insisted was where she belonged. As detectives pieced together Elisa's final hours, they learned that the abuse had escalated in the days leading to her death. A wielder had punished Elisa for the smallest perceived misbehaviors. Witnesses later testified that Elisa had been forced to kneel for hours, denied food, and struck repeatedly. On the night of her death, a wielder lost control entirely, raining down blows on the child until she collapsed, unable to breathe. Forensic evidence told a clear story. Elisa had been struck with objects in addition to being beaten by hand. There were signs of head trauma, internal bleeding, and rib fractures. She had endured such force that her small body could no longer withstand it. It was not a quick death. It was prolonged, painful, and cruel beyond words. When detectives interrogated a wielder, her responses were chilling. She showed little remorse, often deflecting blame and claiming she had simply been disciplining her daughter. To police, it was the final insult, that a mother who had inflicted such horror could not even acknowledge the magnitude of what she had done. Prosecutors would later describe a wielder as cold, detached, and utterly unfit to be called a parent. The case quickly gained national attention. Newspapers ran front-page stories with Elisa's photo, a beautiful little girl with big brown eyes and an innocent smile. The contrast between her angelic face and the horror of her death cut through the noise of a crime-heavy city. Reporters described the crime scene as one of the most violent involving a child in New York's history. TV networks devoted segments to the tragedy, calling it a wake-up call for a system that had ignored too many red flags. The city's residents responded with fury and heartbreak. Candlelight vigils were held in Elisa's memory. Parents wept openly at the thought of a 6-year-old enduring such cruelty. Teachers across the city brought up her name in classrooms, reminding children that they were loved and valued, trying to fill the void that Elisa had been denied. The outrage extended beyond the public. Politicians, child welfare advocates, and community leaders demanded answers. How could this have happened? How could so many reports of abuse be ignored? How could the court have placed Elisa in the hands of a woman so clearly incapable of caring for her? The case became a rallying cry for reform, but for those closest to Elisa, reform would never bring her back. One of the most painful truths about Elisa's murder is that it was preventable. Teachers had raised alarms. Relatives had begged for her safety. Even neighbors had called for intervention. Every warning was documented, yet every warning was brushed aside. When the final beating occurred, it was not just a wielder's hands that killed Elisa. It was also the weight of a system that looked the other way until it was too late. For the officers who responded that night, the memory never left them. Many later admitted that it was the worst case of child abuse they had ever seen. The violence inflicted on such a small, innocent body was not just tragic, it was monstrous. One detective, in an interview years later, said that he could never forget Elisa's face, that it haunted him every time he saw his own children smile. In the courtroom, prosecutors painted a picture of brutality and negligence. They presented medical evidence, testimony from neighbors, and Elisa's own school records as proof of the years of abuse. They reminded the jury and the public that this was not a case of sudden rage, but of systematic cruelty. Wilder Lopez was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to a long prison term, but no prison sentence could equal the life that was stolen from Elisa. The murder of Elisa Esquerdo became more than just a criminal case. It became a defining moment in New York's history, a reminder of the dangers children face when cries for help go unanswered. For many, Elisa's death symbolized the ultimate betrayal, not by strangers, but by the very person who should have loved her most, and by the institutions that should have intervened. The image of that apartment, the horror inside, and the broken body of a 6-year-old girl remain etched into the memory of everyone who came near the case. To this day, police officers and investigators call it one of the most violent cases they have ever seen, not only because of the physical brutality, but because of the innocents destroyed. And yet, Elisa's story did not end with her death. Her memory sparked change, and her name became attached to reforms that aimed to ensure no child would ever be abandoned by the system again. In the aftermath of her murder, New York City was forced to confront its failures and begin the painful process of change. The trial, public outrage, and Elisa's law, the murder of Elisa Izquierdo, did not just devastate her community, it shook the entire city of New York. Almost overnight, Elisa's name became a symbol of injustice, a name whispered in anger, sorrow, and disbelief. The trial that followed was not simply about punishing one woman. It became a national spectacle, forcing everyone to confront the horrifying truth: a 6-year-old girl had been tortured and killed despite countless warnings that her life was in danger. When Awilda Lopez was arrested and charged with the murder of her daughter, the courtroom became the stage for some of the most chilling testimony and evidence the public had ever heard. Prosecutors did not hold back. They laid out the brutal details of Elisa's final hours, the repeated blows, the head trauma, the broken ribs, the untreated wounds. They presented photographs of Elisa, her small body covered in bruises, as proof of years of abuse. It was painful for everyone in that courtroom to see, but it was necessary. The city had to face the reality of what Elisa had endured. Awilda's defense tried to argue that she had not intended to kill her daughter, that the death had been the result of discipline gone too far. But the jury and the public were not convinced. Discipline does not fracture a child's skull. Discipline does not cause repeated internal injuries. What Elisa had endured was not discipline, it was pure violence. The type of cruelty that revealed a mother consumed by rage and addiction rather than love. As the trial unfolded, journalists filled the courtroom, and their reports flooded newspapers and television broadcasts. Elisa's photograph, a little girl with wide eyes and a shy smile, was everywhere. It was impossible to escape her image. Parents across the nation stared at that face and thought of their own children. Teachers wept, social workers felt the weight of guilt, and police officers expressed anger that the system had ignored so many warnings. The outrage grew louder with every passing day. Activists began holding rallies outside the courthouse. Community leaders gave speeches demanding accountability. Parents brought candles and flowers to create makeshift memorials in Elisa's honor. Her story struck a nerve that went far beyond Brooklyn, because people realized that Elisa could have been any child. She could have been a neighbor's daughter, a student in any classroom, or even their own child. In the end, Awilda Lopez was convicted of second-degree murder. The jury needed little time to reach their decision. The evidence was overwhelming, and the horror of Elisa's suffering could not be ignored. Awilda was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. For many, it was not enough. Some called for harsher punishment, arguing that a crime so brutal deserved nothing less than the maximum penalty. Others believed that no sentence could ever measure up to the loss of Elisa's life. But the courtroom verdict was not the end of Elisa's story. In fact, it was only the beginning of something larger. Her death sparked a movement that changed the way New York State handled child abuse cases. Politicians, stung by public outrage, realized that they could not allow another tragedy like this to occur. In the wake of the trial, lawmakers introduced new legislation designed to strengthen child protective services and increase transparency in abuse cases. This legislation became known as Elisa's Law. Officially passed in 1996, Elisa's Law gave the public and the press greater access to records of child abuse cases, creating accountability where there had once been secrecy. No longer could agencies hide behind privacy rules when children were in danger. The law also expanded protections for children and provided more resources to child welfare workers, so that warning signs could not be ignored as easily as they had been in Elisa's case. The passing of Elisa's Law was seen as a victory, but it was bittersweet. Many advocates argued that it should not take the death of an innocent child to create reform. They reminded the public that Elisa's father had begged for her safety, that teachers had reported her bruises, and that relatives had fought for custody. All to no avail. Elisa's Law was important, but for Elisa herself, it had come too late. Even with reform, the scars of Elisa's case remained. For police officers who had walked into that apartment, the memory never faded. For teachers who had watched Elisa grow quiet and fearful, the guilt was unbearable. For her relatives, the grief was lifelong. And for the city of New York, Elisa's death became a permanent reminder of what happens when systems fail. The media continued to cover the story long after the trial ended. Documentaries were produced, newspaper editorials were written, and television segments revisited Elisa's case on anniversaries of her death. Each time, the story was retold not just as a tragedy, but as a warning. If it could happen to Elisa, it could happen to others. And if society wanted to protect its children, it had to learn from its mistakes. One of the most powerful legacies of Elisa's case was the cultural shift it caused. People began to see child abuse not as a private family matter but as a public issue that demanded action. Neighbors became more vigilant. Teachers spoke up more loudly. Social workers received more training. While Elisa's life could not be saved, her story gave courage to others to intervene when they suspected a child was in danger. Elisa's law also gave journalists and the press a stronger voice. Reporters who had covered her story often said that the law allowed them to shine light into dark corners of the system. When agencies tried to hide their failures, the press could hold them accountable. That accountability was Elisa's gift to future children, a gift born out of her suffering. And yet, for all the reform, for all the speeches and promises, the ache of Elisa's loss remained. People would walk past her photograph in memorials and feel tears well up. Teachers kept her schoolwork as a reminder of why their vigilance mattered. Detectives revisited the files and admitted that, even years later, they still had nightmares. Elisa's trial was about justice, but Elisa's legacy became about change. She did not live long enough to see the difference her name would make, but her story reshaped laws, influenced child protection policies, and awakened a nation to the urgent need to protect its most vulnerable. Still, there was one question that lingered: could Elisa's death have truly been prevented? For those who knew her father's pleas, for those who saw the bruises and reported them, for those who heard the cries from the apartment walls, the answer was yes. And that truth is what made her case so painful. Elisa should have been saved. The trial ended with a conviction. Elisa's law was passed. New York City promised never again. But the city still carried the weight of guilt, a collective responsibility for a little girl who wanted nothing more than a home full of love. Why Elisa's story still matters today. Elisa Equiado's story is not only about tragedy, but also about the responsibility we all carry. She was a 6-year-old child who wanted love, safety, and a chance to dream. Instead, her life was stolen in the most violent way imaginable. Police officers who found her body called it the worst case they had ever seen, and decades later, the pain of her story still lingers. But Elisa's legacy is powerful. Her name lives on in Elisa's law, which gave transparency to child protection cases and made it harder for agencies to hide their failures. Her story forced the public to pay attention, to recognize that silence in the face of abuse can be deadly. Elisa's memory continues to inspire teachers, neighbors, and social workers to act when a child is in danger. Every time her photograph appears, we are reminded of the cost of inaction. Elisa is gone, but her story still cries out for justice, not only for her but for every vulnerable child. The most violent case police had ever seen became a symbol of change, and Elisa Equiado, though her life was short, continues to change the world she left behind.